How did the world we know today come to exist? As humanity has grown and developed, its relationship with planet Earth has caused unprecedented change. Over hundreds and thousands of years, the borders between nations have shifted ceaselessly. New technologies and new principles have been responsible for both conflict and unity. All this is the body of history. When it comes to making a mark on history, it's the great empires that have left the biggest prints. Although the concept of imperialism is often viewed unfavorably today, there's no denying that it has shaped our modern global society in extraordinary ways. And it all started back in the Bronze Age, here in Mesopotamia. This is the story of the First Empire. Mesopotamia is the Greek name for a region covering parts of Kuwait, Iraq, and Syria that stretches between the Mediterranean Sea and the Persian Gulf. It has historically been defined by these two rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris. The name Mesopotamia helpfully means land between two rivers. It's an area everyone should know about because of its significance for humanity. Thousands of years ago, this strip of land gave rise to agriculture, astronomy, systems of mathematics and writing, and the very concept of civilization as we know it. It was inhabited by the Sumerian and Akkadian peoples, who created such staples of technology as the wheel. They had clear social and religious principles, which were entwined in multiple pantheons of gods and goddesses. They also had a long history of fighting each other for limited resources. Mesopotamia was generally divided between entities called city-states, each one a city plus the land surrounding it. Each city-state was controlled by a king and had its own army to invade or defend against neighboring city-states. Eventually, these states became united under the world's first known true empire, the Akkadian Empire. The story of this empire, as with so much of ancient history, is shrouded in mystery and speculation. It all started with a man and a city, both of which have been obscured by centuries of legends and incomplete evidence. So take what I'm about to share with a healthy grain of skepticism. Some of this information might turn out to be false one day, but it's the best interpretation I can give you based on the evidence we do have. In the 24th century BCE, 2,334 years before the birth of Christ, something world-changing occurred in Mesopotamia. A man who would later be called Sargon the Great arrived at a site close to where the Euphrates and Tigris rivers came closest together. Tradition states that he founded a new city there, which he named Akkad. However, a few sources speak of Akkad before Sargon's arrival, which suggests that he simply rebuilt or restored an already existing settlement. At an earlier time, Sargon is thought to have worked for the king of Kish, a city-state found just to the south. He was effectively a gardener charged with cleaning irrigation canals, but his official title was Royal Cupbearer. This gave him a good deal of respect and a band of underlings. It seems the young Sargon was an ambitious and power-hungry chap, because at some point he gave up the cupbearer position and used his underlings to overthrow the king. He was then crowned the new king of Kish and began running military campaigns on a scale never seen before. As the years passed and the heads rolled, Sargon the Great and his army expanded their territory in all directions. After either founding or renovating the central city of Akkad, they headed south to subdue the kings of Sumer and take land all the way down to the Persian Gulf. They battled north and west to conquer lands as far away as the island of Cyprus, and possibly even further into the Mediterranean. They braved the steep slopes of the Zagros Mountains in modern Iran to fight campaigns against Elam and other independent kingdoms. Those kings who didn't fall to Sargon's forces were made to pay tribute to his rapidly growing Akkadian Empire. By the time Sargon passed away in 2279 BCE, his dominion covered most of Mesopotamia. Noble men and women of Akkad had been assigned to replace the kings of the cities he conquered. His own daughter, Enheduanna, was made a religious leader in the Sumerian city of Ur. She helped to reinforce the alliance between Akkad and the Sumerians, while acting as her king's eyes and ears at the same time. After all that effort, the Akkadians and the Sumerians were united under a single ruler. Some of them weren't entirely happy about it. The next king of Akkad was Sargon's son, Nemush, and he had to start his reign by asserting dominance over a number of rebellious Sumerian cities. This kind of thing happened several times over the years, and it usually happened in response to rising taxes. Throughout history, taxes have been used to fund growing empires, and throughout history, people have complained about them. Ignoring that issue, living in an empire brought a number of benefits to civilization. It brought security, for example, because any invading force would have to compete with the world's largest army at the time. It also strengthened trade and commerce across the whole region. Merchants could sail freely along the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, and find good prices for commodities like grain, wool, meat, dairy, silver, copper, and textiles. This in turn provided a massive economic boost and sparked a population boom. People living in the Akkadian Empire could have food all year round, something that wasn't guaranteed before Sargon's rule. What a lovely time to be alive! Historians tend to focus on kings and nobles when they talk about ancient Mesopotamia, since those are the people who primary sources focus on. However, I am personally more interested in the lives of everyday people, and I've done my best to piece together how ordinary Akkadian citizens may have lived. First of all, they had a social structure that broadly resembles the feudal system from medieval times, or the caste system that used to exist in India. People were organized in 5 tiers, with the monarchy at top and slaves at the bottom. In between were nobles and religious leaders, then the standard upper class and lower class. Which tier a person belonged in dictated where they lived. Akkadian cities were organized with a radial structure that placed a temple at the center, dedicated to a particular god or goddess, and other buildings in concentric zones around it. The higher in society you stood, the closer to the temple you lived, and therefore the closer you were to the gods. Religion was an integral part of Akkadian life. Everyone with a job, for instance, was not considered as simply doing a job, but as performing a vital function for the community and for the gods' efforts in maintaining peace. Conversely, if you slacked off at work, you might have been shunned as a bringer of famine or disease. Speaking of jobs, there were a lot of trades to choose from in these times. Aside from working as merchants or soldiers, people were employed as farmers, builders, artisans, hunters, healers, potters, weavers, teachers, and priests. All the professions we take for granted today, except IT obviously, were crucial parts of keeping the empire running. Men and women were given mostly equal rights, so they could work the same jobs and receive the same pay. What a lovely time to be alive! Actually, men and women were segregated in one area, education. For some reason, it was thought that women shouldn't be taught how to read and write. This was an older tradition that persisted even after Enheduanna, the same daughter of Sargon who held a strategic position in Ur, published a number of influential religious texts. She is actually the earliest author in history whose name is known to us. At first, people used the Sumerian language to communicate, but it was replaced with the newer Akkadian language sometime around 2200 BCE. Both languages were written in cuneiform scripts, where characters were arranged in grids upon clay tablets. Cuneiform was the earliest form of writing in this part of the world. Now, if you've studied ancient Egypt at all, you might notice some similarities. Both Egypt and Mesopotamia were, and still are, centered around important river systems surrounded by desert. They also produced similar types of monumental architecture. In Egypt, it was the pyramids. In Mesopotamia, it was the temple complexes called ziggurats. However, the two regions differed in one important way, which building materials they could provide. Whereas limestone and granite were readily available for building projects in Egypt, the Akkadian Empire had a poor supply of these resources. There was also little wood available for use as timber. Because of these limitations, Akkadian citizens learned to build their homes out of reeds and clay, which were abundant in the rivers. Lower-class citizens made their homes out of bundles of reeds that were secured in the ground at one end, then tied together at the top to form an arched ceiling. With more reeds forming a carpet on the floor, these dwellings would have been fairly comfortable and easy to maintain. Upper-class citizens used clay bricks that were baked dry in the sun, then painted white and stuck together with a primitive type of mortar. And now that I've said the word primitive, it's time to address one of the key misconceptions of ancient history. When I say something is primitive, that's not the same as saying it's dumb or obsolete. Primitive, in this context, just refers to something that occurred early in history, and conversely the word advanced refers to something that happened later. That's all they mean. Nothing in the story of the Akkadian Empire strikes me as being dumb. The people living in it certainly weren't. They were selectively breeding crops to maximize their yield thousands of years before any understanding of genetics. They painted their houses white because they knew that white reflects heat, and keeping their houses cool was important for their health. They even developed a complex road network and a postal service so that information could flow freely up and down the empire. In fact, these people were not so different from us. They lived by making the most of the technology available, and they would fit right in with our modern way of life, perhaps after a short anime and iPhone adjustment period. Under the reign of Naram-Sin, grandson of Sargon the Great, the empire reached its greatest extent. It covered 800,000 square kilometers of land area, and around 36,000 people lived in the city of Akkad itself. That was an unprecedented achievement for the Bronze Age. Unfortunately, it was during Naram-Sin's time as king that the situation started going downhill. Akkad was attacked several times by a daring force from the Zagros Mountains. They used hit-and-run tactics to launch debilitating raids on the city and its supply lines, then vanished back into the mountains like phantoms. They came to be called the Gutian people. The decline of the Akkadian Empire, much like its origin, is mysterious. It may have been affected by multiple influences that happened to come together at the same time, around 2150 BCE. Firstly, those Gutian raids took a heavy toll on trade and commerce in the empire. Then another series of revolts arose in cities that wanted independence from Akkad, and the king's army no longer had the strength to put them in their place. Finally, a global change in the climate took place that caused a severe drought in Mesopotamia. Scientists call this the 4.2 kilo-year event, and it actually defines the start of the geological age we currently live in. Whether one, two, or all three of these influences played a part, something led to the fall of the Akkadian Empire. It rapidly shrank as more and more city-states claimed independence or fell to invasion. 180 years after its foundation, the empire was reduced to just Akkad, and that was soon taken over by the Gutians. They drove the remaining people out and leveled the great city, perhaps to erase Sargon's legacy from history. And this leads us to the greatest mystery of all. Nobody in the world actually knows where Akkad stood. It was demolished so thoroughly that none of its ruins have ever been found. Historical sources point to the city being located somewhere in this area, where the Euphrates and the Tigris are closest together. Baghdad, the capital of Iraq, dominates this region today. Without direct remnants or ruins to look at, historians have had to reconstruct Akkad based on sources from other cities within the empire. They have retrieved information from clay tablets, pottery, sculptures, and massive stones called victory steels that record military successes. This stele, for example, displays one of Naram-Sin's victories in the 23rd century BCE. In conclusion, as with so much of ancient history, the story of the Akkadian Empire is one shrouded in myth and uncertainty. It's a story that, when you examine the evidence closely, reveals what can be accomplished by ambitious and strong-willed rulers. It also provides a window into the culture of ancient Mesopotamians, both ordinary and extraordinary, for whom spiritual and practical aspects of life were closely intertwined. Finally, as a story framed by conflict, it shows how even the mightiest power of an age can fall to influences outside its control. These are the things history can teach us about ourselves and the world we inhabit. I look forward to exploring them more with you in the next episode of Empires. History can be hard to put into context, especially when it happened thousands of years ago. That's why I've created a timeline to summarize the information in this video. It has key historic events and images, as well as info about rulers and other key figures in this story. You can find a link in the video description below along with credits and references. Happy learning!